Okay, hello everyone. On behalf of the Vax Day Ministry of Apologetics and Regional Faith Romanian Chapter, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Modern biology is often presented as a challenge to belief in God. Yet many recent discoveries in genetics, epigenetics, and cellular complexity raise profound questions about order, purpose, and the nature of life itself. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Garte, scientist and author, who will explore how contemporary biology challenges the reductionist view of life and opens new perspectives in the relationship between science and faith. This conference is part of our ongoing effort to encourage mindful dialogue between science, philosophy, and theology. And please join me and warmly welcome Dr. Garte.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Beata for inviting me to speak. This is the second time I've done this to talk to this group, and I'm very excited about it, especially because since the last time I spoke, there's been so much new material being produced by scientists. And I should say that all the work you're going to hear is being done by scientists who are not, as far as I know, of Christian faith. These are mainstream scientists working in biology, various, various areas of biology, and putting it together with faith is our job. And it's something I've been very interested in. And a lot of this comes from my most recent book, which was published last year, called Beyond Evolution: How New Discoveries in the Science of Life Point to God. And the subtitle tells it all. So what I'm going to present today is basically the idea that there's this new material that's coming out is incredibly important to argue against a strictly materialistic, rationalistic, naturalistic view of reality, certainly of living reality, and that it certainly leaves open the door to God as an important factor in how life works. So let me see, okay, there's the first slide. So the question is, what is life? And that's a very important question that's been around for decades. There have been, I think, 7 books that have been published since 1943 or 4 with that as the title. The first one was by the famous physicist Schrödinger, who, obviously was a brilliant quantum physicist with the Schrödinger equation, but he also was curious about life, and that was the first book that he wrote that has this title. Since then, there have been several more, and none of those books have answered the question, because we don't know. It's very hard to explain what life is, or even to define it. Usually, most definitions are long descriptions of all the things life can do, but that's not a definition. But what I would say is life is different. It's a different science. Biology is a different science from chemistry and physics. There's new things in life that don't exist in physics and chemistry. That will be one of the major themes of this presentation. So let's see what I mean by that. What is it that makes biology different? Biology has several features. Living things have several features that are not found anywhere else, but all living creatures have them. And what are they? All of life self-replicates with high accuracy. What do I mean by that? I mean that any creature, from a bacterial cell to us, to trees, everything that's alive, replicates or reproduces. In other words, there's inheritance. And that inheritance is extremely accurate. Charles Darwin has a phrase where he said the strong principle of inheritance. And by that he meant that all creatures give birth or give rise to, whatever, however they do it, to new creatures that are just like them. And in fact, with most animals today, and for a long time, as far as we know, the accuracy of self-replication is extremely high, but it's not 100%. There's slight differences, and that's important for evolution, as we'll see. What else do creatures do? And this is fairly new. This is something that you'll find in a few papers in the literature. And again, these are people, great pioneers in this work. And what they're saying is that all creatures, not just human beings, but even bacteria and single-cell animals and plants show agency, which means they decide to do things. They act. They have will. And nothing else does. No rock ever says, gee, I think I'll roll down this hill. Looks like fun. No. They only roll down the hill because of gravity and if something pushes them. And that's true for everything that's not alive. But agency exists in all of life. So that's one. That's actually the second. The third is when they use agency and act, they act with purpose. And again, this applies to all living creatures. And that purpose is usually, certainly in the earlier forms of life, to stay alive, to survive, and to reproduce. And we don't know where that came from. The philosophical phrase for this is teleology, but purpose is not exactly the same as teleology, and I'm not going to go into detail there. It's over my head. But we and all life acts with purpose, and nothing else does. Now, if you're going to act with purpose, there are some things you have to know. You have to be able to be aware of your environment, because otherwise you don't know what to do. You have to be able to have some memory so that you remember what happened recently and you don't make a mistake. And some degree of reasoning is required. Now, this is going to come as a surprise to many people. It certainly was to me. But all of life shows cognition. Cognition is what allows for awareness, memory, and reason. It doesn't mean they're conscious. Cognition is useful in consciousness, but bacteria are probably not conscious as far as we know. They do not have brains, but they do have cognition. There is now a huge amount of data showing that bacteria are aware of their environments. They even have memory, and they even can make rational decisions. I'll show you that in detail. So there are four incredibly important things that all of life does that nothing else does. And that's why biology is different. I could stop here, but you would say, wait a minute, I don't believe any of that. So the rest of this talk is going to be showing you why all of these things are true. Now, before we get into that, how did all these things develop? What is the origin of self-replication of high accuracy? What is the origin of agency? The answer is we don't know. We literally have no idea, no clue. Just like we don't know how life began. And apparently when life began, it had all those characteristics, and we don't know how that happened. And one of the things that, of course, is very clear is that human beings can make almost anything. But we cannot make life. We cannot create life. Even if we take all the components of a living cell that died, we can't make it live again. We can put all those components together in a membrane. We don't get a living cell. The closest we ever came was when Craig Venter took some genome and put it into a cell that was otherwise alive, and he had a new cell. But that's not creating life from scratch. And that's not using all the chemicals. So one answer, of course, is that the origin of life came from a divine being, came from God. And I like to call that idea divine design. It kind of is a lot like intelligent design, but I prefer the word divine design because God is not intelligent. We're intelligent. God is way above that. We cannot do all of these things. God can. So I prefer divine design. let's go back to those areas that I mentioned. And the first one was self-replication and highly accurate self-replication. I mentioned that Darwin called this the strong principle of inheritance. And again, I mentioned that nothing in the non-biological world is capable of that. Now, there are things in the biological world, there are items in the non-biological world that replicate, but they don't replicate with high accuracy. One of the things that replicates are crystals, but it turns out that if you look carefully into the literature, you will find, and I have the references in the book I mentioned, that crystals, as they replicate themselves, they break in two, and each half begins to grow, and it sounds like it's replication, but when they break, those breakages cause errors, and every time they break, you get more and more errors until finally you have a bunch of crystals that look nothing like the originals. So accurate self-replication is limited to life. And it's true throughout all of life. Let me give you an example to illustrate this. Suppose you see a house, the one on the left, and you say, I really love that house. I love everything about it. I want to have an exact duplicate of that house. And you tell some builders and architects and engineers, and they charge you a lot of money because it's not cheap to do this. And they build another house that's exactly like that one. But then you say, well, I don't just want the house. I want everything in it to be the same. I want the same furniture, the same books, the same pictures on the wall, the same carpets, everything identical. Well, if you told that to your builder, they'd say, okay, but that's going to be really expensive. We have to buy the books, buy the art. We don't know how we're going to find them, but we'll do it as long as you're willing to pay. And then you get accurate, total self-replication of the house inside and outside. But you cannot find a house that will replicate itself. In other words, you can get people to make a replica of that house, but no house can make a copy of itself. No factory can make a copy of itself. I've gone into this in some detail in some of my writings, and the reasons are incredibly obvious. Well, they're not incredibly obvious, they're incredibly strong. In order to make replicas, you need to have machines within the original house that makes a replica of everything in the house. And who makes the machines? You need machines to make the machines. Life has solved all those problems. If you take a cell, which is here, it automatically, when it gets to a certain size, divides in two, and each of those two cells is 99.9999% the same as each other and the original. That's high accuracy. And we don't know, we know how that works because there are machines that make things in the cells. They're called enzymes. They're called molecular machines. And I'm going to go and show you a few examples. And we know how all of those enzymes, which are made of proteins, we know how they're replicated with great precision and great accuracy. And it's an incredibly complex process. It's called protein synthesis or translation. Nothing like that exists in the non-living world. So let's take a look at that, a little bit of detail, not too much, obviously. One of the ways, as I just said, to make self-replication highly accurate is to have the genetic code, which informs the cell how to make the right proteins exactly correctly as were in the original cell. And here's the genetic code. These nucleotides, originally, this is the DNA version. They're eventually copied into RNA, where all the T's become U's. And each of these codons, which are the three letters, code for a particular amino acid. Sometimes there are only two of them that code for it, two codons. Sometimes there are six, like leucine. Sometimes there are 4, like many of them. And those codons determine which amino acid goes where and when in the new protein that's being made. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the codons, for example, this one here on the left is A, adenosine, C, cytosine, T, thymidine, ACT, and that means make a threonine. That's the amino acid. Put a threonine next in your amino acid sequence in this protein. But there's no chemical reason that this molecule should code for this molecule. This is a nucleic acid. This is an amino acid. This is part of the DNA. This is part of the protein. And there's no chemical connection between them. So this ACT, meaning threonine, is much like the word tree that means a large wooden plant with green leaves. It's just an English way to say it. I don't know the Romanian word for tree. What is it? Anyway, whatever. I know in Italian it's albero. In German it's Baum. So that's because there are many languages for humans, but there's only one language for life, and that's the single genetic code. But other than that, this is a randomly selected, well, we don't know if it's random or not, but it's a selected word, ACT, that means put an amino acid on there. That means it is symbolic information. Okay, it's not Shannon type information, which is present in physics. This is symbolic information like human language. And that's very, very significant. So now we have a problem. And this has to do with the connection between evolution and self-replication. You can't have accurate inheritance unless you have accurate self-replication. And you can't have evolution unless you have accurate inheritance, which means accurate self-replication. So this is a circular reasoning. Each thing, accurate self-replication and evolution, are required for each other. That means that we don't know where this accurate self-replication came from. It could not have evolved. Where it came from, we don't know. Now, this is not proof that this is a divine creation, but that's one good answer. There may be other answers that are perfectly natural, but we don't know what they are, and they don't seem to be in the province of chemistry. We don't know how that could have arisen. So that idea that evolution is required for accurate self-replication is incorrect. Now, I'm going to talk about some other new and very revolutionary ideas in biology that have been published in the last 5 or so years, some of them only a year or two ago. And some of these are very controversial. For example, the first one, organisms can direct their own evolution. Well, that's pure heresy in standard biology, right? We have always learned and taught that evolution is random. It happens after mutations, and then the best organisms that have the best mutation survive. Organisms can't say, I want to evolve, other than if it's Pokemon, right? That does that. But the organisms generally can't say, let me make a mutation here so I can evolve. Well, there's now some evidence that that's not entirely true, that there are certain cases, certain ways that organisms can, in fact, have an influence on how they evolve. And I believe I'll go into some examples of that. If not, I'll answer it in the questions. The other thing is that Lamarck, who said that characteristics which are passed down to the next generation have to be in the germline. In other words, you can't pass down something that happens to you while you're alive in your somatic cells. And that was ruled out by modern theory, but it turns out he was not completely wrong, because there's a new field called epigenetics, which shows that things that you're exposed to during a life, they can be inherited by your children and their children. We don't know how long that can go on. It's not a change in the DNA. It's not a change, sorry, in the sequence of the DNA. It's a change in the structure of one of the nucleotides, namely cytosine. And that has effects on how genes are expressed and what they code for. So this is also very revolutionary, very new. We also know, this is largely the work of James Shapiro, that cells can modify their genes and control their expressions. And as I said before, all life behaves with agency, purpose, and cognition. Let's take a closer look at this agency, and I'm going to present several quotes from the literature by some of the pioneers in this field. Eva Jablonska is one of the earliest pioneers, and she said, "The agency of the organism is central," and she applies that to all organisms. There has been a growing recognition that the purposeful or teleonomic behavior of living organisms themselves has had a major influence in shaping the course of evolution over time. That comes from a quote from a very important book, which I'm about to show you if I can find it. Looks like I moved it. Nope. Sorry, thought I had it right here. Okay. The book is called Evolution on Purpose, and it was published by MIT Press. Now, the title itself, Evolution on Purpose, again, would have been considered absolutely heretical 5 years ago and would never have been published. Corning and several others wrote the introduction to that book, and here it is. That book is very expensive as a hardcover or softcover, but it is free as a download, an ebook download, and I strongly recommend looking for it and downloading it if you're interested. Here's another from Eva Jablonski. Spontaneous activity, the most basic expression of agency, is a biological primitive. All biological systems are inherently active. And notice the word all. And then we have Michael Levin, who is one of the pioneers of this field, says goal-directed function is a primary principle scaled up from basal functions in the most primitive life forms. Some more. We know of no cells from prokaryotes to archaea and eukaryotes that do not exhibit a form of agency. In other words, he's saying all cells do. Cell agency is incontrovertible, but very little is understood about its origin and physical bases. Pretty much what I said before. And finally, Dennis Noble, who is one of the great pioneers in this area, and his brother Raymond wrote, "The existence of purposive agency," so he has both purpose and agency there, "turns out to be one of the most productive and predictive theories of science." Oh, there's one more. Yeah, by James Shapiro, who said Coyne, and that's Jerry Coyne, a fairly well-known American atheist who is has some very strong words to say about religion. Coyne's denial of human agency or choice, and that refers actually to many atheists, not just Coyne, naming both as illusory artifacts of libertarian dualism, is a stunning example of physical reductionism run amok. James Shapiro is another pioneer in this field, and here he is saying that the argument against human agency and Several books have been written. Sam Harris wrote a book saying there's no such thing as free will. Daniel Dennett, another leading atheist, wrote a book called about consciousness being illusory. So many atheists, especially the most militant ones, are countering all of this work by saying that it's not true. There is no such thing as agency, free will, consciousness, or anything else. Dawkins has a famous quote about that, which I'll get to later. Agency is also exhibited by plants. It's not simply that roots and leaves correspond with each other, but the environment has an effect. There are actions taken by roots back on the environment, which then go back up to the leaves. It's a big circle. And all of that is motivated by agency. Now, here are some titles of papers about cognition. These are the actual titles of published mainstream papers in the mainstream literature, all peer-reviewed. All living cells are cognitive. Simple statement. Biomolecular basis of cellular consciousness via subcellular nanobrains. Now, that's controversial. I know the person who wrote this paper, and he will admit that it's controversial, but it's a fascinating idea. Learning in single-cell organisms. This has been established. It's not controversial. How biological codes break causal chains to enable autonomy for organisms. Now, this is fascinating because notice the word code is plural. This doesn't only refer to the genetic code. There are many codes in living organisms, and this is brand new research that I'm just learning about now, and it's absolutely fascinating. And finally, and this again, a title of a paper, a revised central dogma for the 21st century. This is the new dogma. All biology is cognitive information processing. Now, how is this possible? How can we say that single cells that have no brains, no eyes, no nose, no ears, how can we say that they communicate, that they're aware of their environment, that they can, do all of this stuff, be aware, have cognition? And the answer is, it's true. It's not brains. It's something else called signal transduction. And what that means is that cells have receptors on their membranes, which are constantly grabbing from the environment various, various chemical signals that tell the cell information about the environment. So, for example, if you have a single cell, and I forgot the kind this is, I believe it's a type of bacteria, it's all by itself. It doesn't know that there are any cells around it, and there aren't any cells around it. But now if you have a high cell density situation where there are many cells together, notice these little red triangles. These are signals that each cell sends out. And each of these cells has receptors that recognize these signals and bind them. So say this cell is finding 3 of these signals, and some of them are finding even more. This cell is finding 4 of them. And once that happens, this cell now, quote, knows that it's surrounded by others like it. It knows it's part of a large group. And when that happens, all the cells together produce a light. Now, if it was only one cell producing a light, it wouldn't have any effect because it's a tiny cell, it'll be a tiny amount of light. But if this represents 1 million cells in a group, and they're all putting out light at the same time, you will actually see it. So this is how you have bioluminescent bacteria. All over they're in the ground, they're in the ocean, they're in lakes and ponds. They get together as a group, they tell each other, oh, we're all here, let's make light, and they do. No brains needed. It's signal transduction. Now, there are a lot of questions about this. I'm not saying the whole thing is solved. For example, how do the cells process the information coming from the receptors? We don't know that. So here's some more detail on that. E. coli has more than 10,000 sensing receptors on its membrane. Every bacterial cell has 10,000 receptors of this type on its plasma membrane. And they can provide information to the cell about whether they're alone or with others, and also for danger or finding food. All of this because of chemical signal transduction. Now, here's the idea. You remember I mentioned something about the nanobrain, and here's the reference to it by Bill Miller, who's this, and his co-authors are the real pioneers in this field. And what they found was that there are some receptors that form clusters at one end of the cell. Their hypothesis is that these clusters somehow are able to act like a nanobrain and put together all the information coming from the receptors. I don't think that has been shown absolutely true yet, but that's their working hypothesis. So let's say we do a laboratory experiment where we take cells growing on a dish at a normal temperature of 37 degrees, and we decide to lower the oxygen level that are available to the cells. Now, this does not kill the cells. We don't cut off all the oxygen. We just lower the oxygen level a little bit. And the cells are able to survive because they switch their metabolism to a different system that is able to work under lower oxygen levels. And there are many bacteria that have this ability. So once they change their metabolic cycle to adjust to the lower oxygen, now we repeat this several times. In other words, we raise the temperature and then we lower the oxygen. What happens is that after several repetitions of this cycle, the cells will learn that higher temperatures always lead to a lower oxygen level. They actually learn that. And what they do is they will begin to alter the metabolism, not when the oxygen is lowered, but before that. They begin to change their metabolism right after the temperature is raised. So they have learned that raising the temperature is followed by lowering oxygen. And this is like Pavlov's dog. When you ring the bell, the dog knows that food is coming. And this is being done not by an animal who's hearing and thinking and everything. This is being done in cells. Okay, there's another example of cell cooperation, which is very important, called hypermutation. And what that is about is that cells will increase their error rate in DNA replication. They use enzymes to do that. And you get more mutations. Let's see, am I okay? Yeah, okay. I can tell I'm blocked if I don't see any movement. So let me go again. Hypermutation will increase the error rate on purpose of DNA replication, and that leads to a temporary, localized increase in mutations. Why do they do that? They do that when they're exposed to some dangerous, toxic, or there's something bad going on, and they're not able to deal with it. They make lots of mutations, hoping that one or more of them will allow them to survive. Of course, most of the mutations die, but some of the mutants actually do get a mutation that's good for them, and they're able to survive and repopulate the colony. Now, this can only occur if the entire population undergoes this change together at the same time, and that requires communication between cells. And there's a reference there to my paper, which talks about this as a theoretical approach, understanding survival. Now, talking about purpose, which I'm now going to call teleology here, This is not well known, but Charles Darwin and his son, Francis Darwin, and Asa Gray, who was one of his main followers, were all very much in favor of the idea of teleology, of purpose in life. And what Asa Gray wrote was that we recognize the great service rendered by Darwin to natural science by restoring teleology to it. So that instead of having morphology against teleology, we shall henceforth have morphology married to teleology. In other words, in those days, biology was simply descriptive. It was morphology. This cell is, this organ is this big, this organ looks like that. There was nothing behind it, no theoretical purpose, nothing. And what they said was that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection actually provided a teleological basis for life. And in fact, all living creatures, plants and animals, do all the innumerable things they do for a purpose, and that is to stay alive and to reproduce. And as I mentioned before, nothing else does that. Here's the book that I mentioned. I have a copy, but I don't know where I put it. Evolution on Purpose, Teleonomy in Living Systems. And you see, if you look at the bottom of this, you'll see the editors are Peter Corning, Stuart Kaufman, Dennis Noble, James Shapiro. These are very famous pioneers in the new fields of evolutionary biology. Give you one more example. I'm almost done. This is an experiment that was actually done a long time ago, but it was recently brought to light by Michael Levin, who, as I mentioned, is one of the great young pioneers in this whole field. And here's what it's showing. There's newts have kidneys, very small kidneys, obviously. And those kidneys have tubules which carry fluids through the kidney. The tubules are made of cells. We see the cross section here. If you look at the top, if you look at the left, you'll see two tubules, each of which is made out of 8 cells. You see the nucleus of the cell there. And it makes the lumen, which is the pathway that the liquid flows. It's critical that the lumen be a particular size. If it's too narrow, narrow, nothing will get through. If it's too wide, there's not enough pressure to move the fluid through. So what happens if you take cells that are now twice as big, and you can find those experimentally? So now you have large cells. You'd expect to have a lumen that's much larger than it's supposed to be. But instead, no, what happens is the organism in its development doesn't use 8 cells to make the kidney tubule. It uses 4 of them, half the number, and you end up with exactly the right size lumen. Even more striking is if you make these cells really large so that one cell by itself, folding over itself, can make a tubule. That's what happens. And we have no idea how organisms are able to do this, because they're following a program which says, we want the lumen to be this size, however you can do it that way. That's the end goal. And the organism follows that end goal. So we don't know the mechanism, because it's 2 completely different mechanisms. If you take these cells and bend them over each other, that's completely different from joining them together. So this kind of creativity is totally unexpected and unexplained in biological development. So where do we go from here? Well, again, I'm going to repeat: agency, cognition, and teleology, which together form ACT, are central to understanding life, all of life, and only life exhibits this. Biology, these are the conclusions I'm coming to. Biology exceeds the laws of physics and chemistry. It doesn't disobey those laws, but it has more going on than just those laws. And so what we need are new biology-specific theories and laws in order to understand life and, of course, humanity. And we don't know what those laws will be. There are some ideas, but they're very, very preliminary at this point. I talk about all of this in my latest book, which I mentioned before, Beyond Evolution, How New Discoveries in the Science of Life Point to God, published by Tyndale House in 2025. And I have some other chapters as well, such as The Origin of Life and about human consciousness. So to sum up, to finalize this, probably many of you know this very famous quote by Richard Dawkins, one of the leading atheists. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I find that very depressing and and untrue, and this is my version of a better credo. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties, including life, we should expect if there is at bottom a grand design, a purpose, such as the existence of life that can worship its creator, good and evil, and all that is needed to justify belief in the presence of God. And I will stop there and answer any questions. How can evolutionary theism reconcile the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection with the belief that God intentionally created and guides life? Okay. By evolutionary theism, I think is meant theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, probably. And yeah, so the way I do that is that I believe that evolutionary theory, as the modern version is, which is very different from the original or from the earlier neo-Darwinism. So my suggestion is, when you talk about evolution, you have to make clear that what you're talking about is the most up-to-date version, which is a lot of what I talked about today, which is very different from neo-Darwinism. But then I still think that that kind of evolutionary process exists. I'm not a young Earth creationist. And I think that the way to explain it is that evolution, I do have a slide about this, but it's not on this group. What evolution does is explain everything about how life came to be from the first living cell up until just before the origins of humans. Evolution does not explain the origin of life. Nobody says that it does. No scientist. Richard Dawkins agrees that evolution cannot be used to explain the origin of life. And of course I do too. And I believe, as says here, that God intentionally created life. I also, and this Dawkins does not agree with this, I also believe that evolution did not create humanity. I think that our bodies came from evolution. We have the physical bodies similar to apes to some extent, but that doesn't explain humanity. Our souls, our creativity, all the things that make us human, the fact that we're talking to each other, who knows how far away, and all of that technology, all of our art, even our science, none of that can be explained by evolution. That's a gift of God as well. So that's how I reconcile the scientific theory with God's creation and guidance of life. I think God guided life to get to where we are, and we are the creatures who have the consciousness and the perception and everything else that we need, the soul, to be able to worship our Creator. Okay.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead.
I'm a pastor, so not very scientifical. Anyway, how did your work in biology, Dr. Garte, led you to see science and faith as complementary rather than contradictory? And what advice would you give a pastor who has to talk to young people about what they discover in science and what their teachers or professors say is not compatible with I don't know, religion or faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. My story is a little complicated. I started out, my parents and grandparents were atheists and communists, actually. And I grew up that way, and I was a very strong atheist most of my life. And I began thinking about the possibility that maybe there's something wrong with the atheist version of pure materialism when I started learning about quantum theory in as a chemistry major in college. And quantum theory is really weird. It doesn't fit with that materialism. It's scientific, there's no question about that, but it's not materialistic in the sense of, mechanics and all the other things I learned in chemistry and physics. So that put a sort of a dent in my worldview, and I wondered how does this fit in? Uh, then I began learning about biochemistry in grad school, and I couldn't believe it when I learned about the protein synthesis system. I mean, that's incredibly complex, and I've written about this and talked about it many times. And I couldn't understand how this could have developed spontaneously in some way. I had no idea, and I've never come to an answer to that. And that made me think more about this idea of, well, maybe it's not true that materialism explains everything. And I did talk about all of this in my first book called The Works of His Hands. The subtitle is A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith, and that's my story. And there were other things about science that, didn't quite fit with that worldview. But the other thing that happened, I didn't come to faith through science. I came to faith through the work of the Holy Spirit. I was gifted with some dreams and experiences that I couldn't explain any other way. And I'm not going to go into those, but they're in the book, and they're also on a lot of YouTube videos that I've made over the last few years. So if you're interested, you can look for those. And once I came to faith, I then had to face, okay, how do I reconcile this with science, which is your question? And it turned out it was not hard at all. If you really look into any science closely, yes, you'll find things that contradict strict literal biblical interpretation, especially the Old Testament. But, that's a new thing because literal interpretation of the Bible began with the Seventh-day Adventists in the end of the 19th century. Before that, nobody interpreted the Bible, quote, literally. I mean, and you can read great sayings by Aquinas and by other early Christians explaining why that doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, the literal interpretation is not of any interest to me. I think that if you read, for example, Genesis carefully and not, focusing on silly things like, the age of the earth based on which by the way is never stated in Genesis. The age of the earth is based on the written genealogies, and who knows if they're right. I mean, I doubt they're right. But anyway, so if you look at all of these biblical texts in a more open view, without having to say, "Oh, it's exactly what it means. It says what it means what it says." No, that's nonsense. The Bible is, I mean, Jesus Christ is God incarnate. He talked in parables. He told us stories to illustrate his points. I mean, that's the reality of the Bible. It's an incredible book, and it's not an auto mechanic manual on how to, build a car. I mean, it's not literal. It's way beyond that. It's poetic, it's stories, it's fascinating. And so I don't have any conflict with biblical Christianity and science. I mean, science tells us how the world works. The Bible tells us how we're supposed to live and how we're supposed to worship God and love each other. There's two different things. Science doesn't tell us how to do that. So I don't see any conflict, and that's why my second book is called Science and Faith in Harmony. And there I say science and faith don't sing the same song, but the songs they sing are in perfect harmony because they go beautifully together. And thank you for holding that up. Yep, I got a copy of that too. So, I mean, it's a great question because the answer is really long. It took 2 books to write it all. It's how do you tell a pastor? I'm not the only one writing about this. There are several very good books that talk about science and faith together. Hugh Ross, Stephen Meyer, Michael Gwillan, and I'm leaving out a lot of people. There have been some great books written about science and faith not being in conflict, and it's becoming a much more widespread understanding now, especially among Christians. Young Earth creationists, I think, will eventually give up their kind of cultic status. I hate to say that, but it's true. Especially people like Ken Ham, who say that if you don't believe in my view, then you're a heretic, and that to me is heresy because Christians should be united and not divided by these very silly arguments. Yeah, that's another very good question. And I have had 1 or 2 such dialogues. I will tell you the answer is kind of strange because most atheists that I've had debates with and argued with, talked with, bring up the question of proof. How can you prove that your God exists? And my answer to that is I say to them, look, you're a scientist. You know that we don't deal with proof. And I told, there was one atheist who was not a scientist who asked me this. And I said, if you can find me one published paper that uses the word proof in it, that's not math and not logic, show it to me because there are none. We talk about evidence. We don't talk about proof. So I had one debate with an atheist scientist who told me there is no evidence for God. And I said, that's not true because evidence is not proof. The very fact that life exists is evidence for God because we don't have any other explanation. And if you have a phenomenon anywhere, could be a laboratory, situation. If you come up with a finding and you have one possible explanation, hypothesis for the finding and no others, you can say that your finding is evidence for that explanation. Okay, or your explanation is maybe true. You don't know because you don't have an alternative. Now, the only alternative, for example, the fine tuning of the physical constants, everybody agrees that's one of the strongest scientific pieces of evidence for the existence of God. Now, there's an alternative explanation for that, which is a multiverse. And we are just lucky that we are in the right one that has the right constants. If people don't know what I'm talking about, it's called the fine-tuning argument. You can find it anywhere online. The problem with the multiverse alternative is that we can never examine or explore the multiverse. By definition, you can't go from one universe to another. That's what a universe means. If we could go from our universe to another universe, it would all be one universe. So the multiverse is a hypothetical idea that is no better than the God hypothesis. We can't prove God. We can't prove the multiverse. We can't investigate the nature of God. We can't investigate the nature of the multiverse. So those two answers are equally evidential. And so you can choose. I choose God because I believe in God. So, sometimes it's clear that there are many examples of evidence for God which cannot be cannot be argued against. The fine tuning argument is one, but I think in biology there are many, and I mentioned many of them. I talked about, where does agency come from? What's the origin of agency in life? Or of the other things, cognition and teleology. We don't know where that came from. We have no idea. I think a very good explanation is divine design, that God created life that way. We don't know how, and hopefully somebody very, very smart will find out how. In other words, how did bacteria begin to become, able to have agency? Maybe, maybe not. But up at this point, we can say that the God hypothesis, as Stephen Meyer calls it, the God hypothesis is not a bad answer. The same is true for the genetic code, which is what he mostly talks about. But there are many aspects of life where the God hypothesis is the best thing we have.
Thank you so much again. God bless you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of it. And God bless all of you. Thank you.
Bless.